Welcome to Weekly Recaps, where we discuss some of the top stories in business, technology, and politics. Kicking it off, the United States and Iran have come to the negotiating table. And although things are not finalized, President Trump's prior statement in 2020 regarding Iran never losing a negotiation seems to hold as true. So far, this MOU is going to allow Iran to export their oil and possibly have a $300 billion infrastructure rebuild after the bombings. Like I said, this deal isn't finalized, so there's still some terms that are getting negotiated out. And President Trump doesn't seem to be too optimistic about how this whole situation went. As our back is currently against the wall, we had about 4 weeks left before our oil reserves would have been depleted. And that's why some of these terms seem to be in favor of Iran. However, I did hear in the All In podcast by David Sachs that the U.S. would not be responsible for a single penny the $300 billion infrastructure rebuild. He had mentioned that the GCC countries would be responsible for that. And it seems like the biggest advantage the U.S. gets from this is the possibility that we will extract their uranium stockpile, which would likely delay the chances of them going nuclear by 10 years. And as we hinted at over a month ago, a few days after the SpaceX IPO, they officially executed the option to buy Cursor. And this is potentially one of the most important aspects of the comprehensive network that is now SpaceX. With AI encoding capabilities continuing to ramp up, Cursor is one of the most widely used and highly acknowledged developer tools. This was a purely stock play, which means Elon used his now liquid SpaceX stock to purchase the company. And all throughout his career, you've seen this move, and this is truly what has made him the wealthiest individual. He has continued to leverage his businesses to purchase other businesses. And of course, you're going to have people that are saying, yes, it's way overvalued. Majority of the value is coming from the public expectation people have for Elon. And although that's true, he has found an effective way to continually acquire companies that make real change. Speaking of real change, as last week we discussed Anthropic taking down their Fable 5 model at the request of the Trump administration, we now have a little more context and back and forth to discuss more in depth into what happened. So Anthropic released Fable 5, which is a Mythos class model, to the public last Thursday. And prior to this, some of their partners and the NSA, the federal government, had access to these Mythos class models to test them, see if they find any security vulnerabilities and things of that nature. And just after launch, one of their partners and largest shareholders, Amazon, found a security issue that was a big enough concern for them to flag it with Anthropic. And Anthropic dismissed it and even cited that other open models have similar security issues. But the big deal here is AWS is what's powering Anthropic's system. So Amazon would also have the potential of being breached if Anthropic got breached. So although there is a true partnership, there's also kind of back holes into Amazon's own system, which is why they brought up this issue. And after understanding Anthropic wasn't going to solve anything, Amazon went to Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick and told him about the issue. And it's obvious there's some political dispute back and forth between Anthropic's leadership and the Trump administration. So not only that, but now the Secretary of Commerce direct dials Dario Amodei and says, hey, we need to limit this to only national citizens. And the Trump administration had also known that Anthropic was partnered with a Korean company that could potentially have ties to China. So there was also organizational risk there. And after a day or two, Anthropic shut down the Fable 5 model for everyone. And now we'll see how things play out. Also in AI, China has two big stories this week, one of them being ZAI releasing their new frontier model. And most of the Chinese models are open source, so the technology is less proprietary and it allows developments to happen a lot faster, which has led to ZAI releasing their GLM 5.2 model, which ranks higher than OpenAI's GPT 5.5 on a handful of metrics. And the main thing is it's 6 times cheaper. And that's going to be the tough thing with open models and AI in general is China currently has the energy infrastructure and access to a larger labor market and cheaper labor, which can allow them to produce more effective models at cheaper costs. And you can see here that Elon thinks China will develop a Mythos class model similar to Fable 5 with Anthropic by 2027. And Tengji, who's the founder of ZAI, believes it will come even sooner. Continuing with Chinese models, DeepSeek has always been at the forefront of the AI innovation coming out of China. And they recently became the most valuable model after their fundraise. And they plan on using this capital for research and development, as well as expanding some of their computational infrastructure. I believe their goal is to become similar to NVIDIA, an all-in-one house, so they don't have to rely on other companies for their technology and energy needs. The Air Force recently awarded contracts to Anduril and General Atomics to build more autonomous fighter jets. And this marks somewhat of a milestone because Anduril is less than 10 years old. And about 2 years ago is when they launched their first prototype. So is the quickest time from launch to being rewarded a contract for a defense company. and the first time in the last 50 years that a new company has won a fighter project. Speaking of war, about a month ago, we had mentioned Sweden providing Ukraine with fighters, as well as the EU being willing to fund some of those purchases. And last week in Moscow, the capital of Russia, we saw oil refineries getting blown up due to infiltration from Ukrainian drones. So we're starting to see a shift of control within this war. And the interesting thing is, it's been reported that Ukraine has a credit system they're using for their troops. So essentially, if someone blows up a critical infrastructure, such as this oil depot in Russia, their unit will be rewarded with credits that they can then use to purchase better equipment. So essentially, they've gamified this war process for their internal troops to take more risks, and in situations like this, take out critical infrastructure. Due to that, the Russian economy is struggling, with interest rates at 14.25%, as well as 1 in every 4 gas station being one use only. On top of all that, the EU is now talking about bringing Ukraine in as they're seeing who now has the upper hand. And in the last year or so, we've already seen individual countries paying Ukraine loads of money to understand how they're utilizing drone technologies within warfare. And I'll link this video in the description because it does a way better job at breaking down the entirety of this situation. And then lastly, Fed Chair Kevin Warsh had his first FOMC meeting where there was a little bit of comedy with reporters asking the same question, and he essentially said, I just answered that. So you can see a little bit of personality coming out with him, but the main thing I want to highlight here is the language he's using. It seems like Warsh wants to lead the Fed into having less guided language of what's coming in the future so that there's less predictable speculation. And now that I'm thinking of it, that's quite strange because I feel like the more guided language you have, the better for price stability. However, where it's better for that not to be the case is when we have geopolitical conflicts or things that arise that can be unpredictable, which could flip the switch faster. That's all for this week's recap. If you enjoyed the video, please do me a favor and like and subscribe. And if you'd like to see prior videos, you can click on the playlist here. And thanks for watching.